Man. Man, I'll be honest right now. I am entertained by watching the Sam and Max show. Like, watching Sam and Max is pretty damn entertaining, but watching this version from Telltale Games is pretty good. Like, I love Telltale Games so much, and watching the Sam and Max is pretty damn entertaining for what it is. Like, season one, episode two of the Sam and Max is pretty damn good. I'm entertained by this. It's pretty damn good. All I can say is it's pretty good footage to watch, and I really enjoy it for what it is. Not bad. But not bad, as I say, as we're going to review the IBO, the International Boxing Organization. I have talked about this a bunch of times about the IBO, and it's a doozy. So like I said before, the IBO have been involved with the four governing bodies, even though as an independent organization, minor weight, it's not recognized by any of the belts. And even on Wikipedia, it does state a quote, as of 2023, IBO title have been unified with titles with the other bodies in several weight classes. WBC, the website, highlights the importance of the recognition of implications in multiple governing bodies in boxing. While the IBO operates independently, its titles being unified by WBA, IBF, WBO in certain divisions demonstrates how these organizations work together despite initial rivalries. So like I said before, in 1988, the IBO was involved in the founded at the time, but it was incorporated in Illinois in 1992 by John W. Wadona. And they managed to push themselves together. But they actually moved to a beautiful place called Florida, where it doesn't snow. By the way, my brother and a bunch of people stated why people like to visit Florida. I love visiting Florida when you have to understand what the environment is all about back then. So it's pretty decent for what it is. And knowing about the weather, still good. But of course, that's not important right now, other than what we're watching here. So yes, in 1997, they moved to the IBO and then different corporation, Florida. Ed Levine would take over for it, who continues to serve the organization as the president and partner of the presidents in the IBO at this time and still do. And even though the IBO have been recognized in the regionals, they do a lot of other interesting things, implementing per weight divisions, and they do have coordinates. They are now employees since 2014 for BoxRec as the independent boxing records keeper, and they do computerized rankings website to produce IBO rankings. So it's great that someone does take a good care about this. And I do think the IBO is doing a good job. And if it is possible that any of the ranking systems could take away this, it's possible. So I have talked about this, of how the IBO got recognized in 1992. A few title fights happened. And then in November of 1992, the IBO belt was finally born into the boxing world of pro boxing in the heavyweight division. The first ever heavyweight title fight, and by the way, they have a record of 53 title fights. Crazy. And I forgot to accidentally click on something. I actually messed that up. Give me a second. There we go. Yeah, 53 title fights. Crazy. So on November the 14th, 1992, Pinkwin Thomas, former heavyweight champion, takes on a 6-1-2 fighter named Craig Payne. Former WBC champion who defeated Tim Witherspoon in 84, lost against Trevor Berbick in 86. A guy that was out of his prime. After he started losing fights against guys like Mike Tyson in 87, lost against Holyfield in 88, and then in 1990, he makes a comeback, wins a fight, loses against guys like Mike Hunter, Riddick Bowe, and Tommy Morrison in 91. A year later, his pro career is dead. And then for some reason, he comes back a full year and 3 months later on May the 29th, takes on a nobody with a 1-4-1 record in May, And then later in June, he wins a 10-round fight. And then he takes on a couple of Sakura Hagiwara fighters named Terry Miller, Bobby Jones in July the 31st and August the 1st, 2 a day apart of each other, wins both fights easily, 4 wins. Then he takes on a guy that has no relation of James Bonecrusher Smith, just another guy that has a name of James Smith, who has a 0-2 record, and August the 8th, 1 week later, Planquin fights him again as well. And then he takes on a guy with a 12-22-2 record 6 days later on the 14th, wins, and then 8 days later, he defeats another guy with an 0-3 record. And then on September the 5th, another win again, first round. 2 weeks later on the 19th, he wins another fight against a jobber. And then 6 days later on the 25th of September, he wins another fight. And then a week later on October the 2nd, he defeats another guy with a 6-5 record. And then 20 days later, on October the 22nd, he takes on an 8-1-1 fighter, and which was his best fight. So after his Tommy Morrison defeat and his comeback in 92, he's fought 12 professional fights. And then 3 weeks later, on November the 14th, he gets a title shot against Craig Payne, who had a 6-1-2 record, and his pro debut started back in 1985, where he wins a fight, but then doesn't come back to boxing again until July of 91. He wins a couple more fights. By the end of 91, in December, he scores a split draw, wins another fight in January, draws a fight again in February, and then 2 months later, on April the 21st, he takes on a 1-0 fighter and loses his first fight by decision. And then in June, he wins another fight, this time by his first ever fight by knockout. And then in October, a few weeks ago, he wins another fight against someone that was a journeyman fighter, and he won it. Now he's fighting against Planquin Thomas. Unfortunately, there's no fight footage of this, but the report stated that Planquin Thomas won this fight by split decision to become the first one to become IBO Heavyweight Champion. So, yeah. That right there just says a lot. The first IBO belt on the line, and that's what we get. I just don't know what to say about that. I really don't know what to say about that, other than it's ridiculous, but it's funny enough. By the way, the rest of Craig Payne's career ended badly. He lost against Lionel Butler, who is like the Sakura Hagiwara of boxing. And speaking about him, he's going to play a huge part in this entire episode. And of course, Craig Payne would lose against guys known for boxing, guys like Ray Anis, Mike Hunter again, Shannon Briggs, who was 20-0 back in 1995, past prime fighter guys of James Tillis, Iron Barkley, Frezzo Kendo, decent guys until 2001. Unfortunately, Planquin Thomas would vacate his title, and he would box again in January of 93, where he took on a guy named Lawrence Carter, who was 21-5. This time, this was for the inaugural vacant WBF World Boxing Federation World Heavyweight Champion. Another minor weight belt. And Lawrence Carter defeated him in round 7 and never fought again. So that's great. Love it. So on February the 23rd, a month later, Lionel Butler takes on a guy named Tony Willis. And there is fight footage on YouTube for this. The fight itself had moments. They did have talk about this or that. They did show pre-fight footage, and I have seen the footage of the fight. They did show us knockouts, great wins. Lionel Butler, a person that lost fights in his first pro debut career, like a Sakura Hagiwara, who was just a jobber, waste of time. Guys, this should have been like the rendition of what it should have been like from the anime show of Sakura Hagiwara. Definitely, because this is what it would have reminded me of if episode 9 would have been a more better finish than anything else. Definitely. It really is, because it is upsetting to see this, because episode 9 of the anime show Wanna Be the Strongest in the World, when Sakura Hagiwara took on against Tojo Jackal and Jackal won, this right here should have been a turnaround where a person with a record of 21-5 was Jackal, which was Tony Willis, and Lionel Butler, who had a record of 14-10-1, not a good record, was Sakura Hagiwara. And Hagiwara won this fight by round 5 TKO, ended the fight, becoming IBO Heavyweight Champion. I'll be honest, this moment in boxing was pretty good. And even though Tony Willis did lose fights against dangerous guys like Orwin Norris in 1990, and last August, his last fight against Tim Witherspoon ended him. And even though Lionel Butler was on a winning streak against nobodies, except he did win some fights in 92, guys like David Dixon, and in August as well, he defeated Tony Tubbs, former champion, and then defeated someone in November a year later, which was his last fight. So, all in all, it was a good win. And then suddenly, in the month of March, the title was stripped again. Why? Who knows? But surprisingly, before August the 4th, Lionel Butler, as Sakura Hagiwara, in my opinion, came out of nowhere and just outboxed everyone here. By the way, that fight was also for the California State Athletic Commission title that same night. Who knows? But again, like I said before, Lionel defeated Craig Payne, won multitude of fights later on to its career, lost against Lennox Lewis in May of 95, and then guys like Chris Bird, who was 15-0 in April of 96. But that didn't stop him. Lionel Butler came out of nowhere, took on someone named Marcus Gonzalez in January of 97, and became WBF World Heavyweight Champion. Did lost the fight 3 months later against Michael Grant by a round 4 DQ with repeated blows, and won another fight 6 months later against someone named Cleveland Woods until then. But we'll get to that story with the rest of the career later. All we know is on August the 4th, Darnell Nicholson took on against John Ruiz. And John Ruiz was the fighter of a Puerto Rican white hope from Massachusetts, the last ever heavyweight boxer to become champion in the New England territory of the 6 states of New England. And Darnell Nicholson defeated John Ruiz by split decision, with scorecards reading 115-113, 2 for each, and the other was 118-110. But yeah, and even though John Ruiz was still trying to recover in his last 5 fights when he lost his first pro fight, so seeing him lose this fight by close decision is ridiculous enough. And by the way, the scorecards, in my opinion, I had it really tough, because even though John Ruiz did outbox him in the first couple rounds of the fight in a few, and he won the first half, in my opinion, and then in the second half was somewhat even in the steamers, and then in the championship rounds, Darnell came back stronger than ever and won the last 3 rounds. I had the fight 114-114, but I think if John Ruiz should have had one of those last championship rounds, I would have given it to him as a win. So I think that was John Ruiz's fault for giving Darnell that win. He should have got the remainder rounds in. Yeah, not good. So yeah, that was a good win for Darnell Nicholson, and unfortunately, that would be it for his career. He would lose against guys like Kirk Johnson, Andrew Galata in 96, later on, and then win multitude of fights against nobodies and journeyman fighters, until he lost against David Tua in 2001 and Klitschko in 2003 by utter knockouts. John Ruiz would get another chance in boxing. Even after getting beaten up by David Tua, he just continued. But in October the 29th, 1994, which was around the same time when Darnell vacated his title, A fighter born in Samoa, living in New Zealand, got a title fight. Jimmy Thunder, or known as James Thunder, versus Richard Mason. From the USA, Richard Mason, who does live in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, came in after losing against Orlin Norris in April of 93, and even though James Thunder lost against a future cruiserweight legend of Johnny Nelson in November, both of these guys would come back from their victories and start a new year in 1994, winning fights, well, mostly for James, while Richard Mason, his only one fight at that time in 94 was against Ed Strickland, the Sakura Hagiwara. And there's going to be a lot of Sakura Hagiwaras. Keep that in mind. But again, that was the only fight. Ed Strickland's record was 0 wins, 32, all by knockout losses, also from Cincinnati, Ohio. Respect. So James Thunder is fighting a guy like that, and for some reason, Richard Mason gets a title fight and almost got James Thunder out of contention. Scorecards Reddit, 114, 113, 116 111, 115 112. James Thunder, first New Zealand boxer to become heavyweight champion, depending on who you ask. All in all, there's nothing you can say about this. James Thunder would go on to amass a good amount of respect for himself in boxing. Now, the reason I'm skipping through a lot of these fights, and by the way, just to let you people know, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There's only 12 professional fights that are on this list. Even though there's 53 title fights in the IBO, 12 of them from the Pinklin Thomas before 1999, there's only 12 title fights in the IBO. Well, 13 of them in the 1990s. The 13th title fight was Lennox Lewis versus Evander Holyfield 2. Funny. So that right there says a lot. So all I can say about this is this, and even though we're 17 minutes into this podcast, I just want to skip through James Thunder and talk about a boxer in 1996 a lot sooner than it is. So I know I'm talking so much, not taking a breath. I just want to get through all this stuff quickly because I know in my last episode of the WBO, I was talking about Scoochon and trying to find photos and video and proof about her. And I was talking so much about Dana White and such that I just want to get through this stuff because I just want to talk about a boxer that I want to see if he was a jobber or not, or a hype job. So I'm just trying to get through with all this as best I could. So like I said before, in December the 6th, James Thunder gets his first title defense in Michigan, Auburn Hills Palace, to take on former champion Tony Tubbs. And the problem was James Thunder, 28 years old, 6'2", against 6'3" orthodox Tony Tubbs. I don't know. Like even though Tony Tubbs took on some interesting fighters from Jose Ribalta, Tyrell Briggs in 93, and again Everett Martin in February. But again, those aren't really good competitors to fight in. But it does make sense why he even had a title fight. So it kind of makes sense. All we could say is one judge had it 114 even, while the others had it 114 to 113, and the other had it 115 to 114. Winner by majority decision, James Thunder. Why James Thunder won this fight? I don't know, because after trying to find footage of the fight and seeing how close it was hard for me to review this as a close fight. I had it 114 to 114 even as well, so I just couldn't find a winner for this fight. But again, whoever gave it 115 to 114, or even 114 to 113 for crying out loud, I gotta go back and watch the footage. So in August the 8th, James Thunder defeats Ray Anis in round 7 by TKO, and he vacates the title. Why? We don't have the information on why these titles are vacant, even on Wikipedia, so we'll never know. All I know is we're 20 minutes into this podcast, and I know we're going to talk so much about this because this one is going to be a doozy. And this slushy is not helping me. Okay, so here's what I have to say about the entirety of the IBO. So Jimmy Thunder, James Thunder, whatever you like to call him, has defended the belt 2 times. He vacates the belt in July. And the reason he vacates, so here's the thing. It's stated that he vacated the belt on July the 16th, but then he had a fight in August the 8th against Ray Anis, so he won the fight. So why was the belt vacated away from him? Why doesn't say that? Well, here's the information that I know already and looked up the information. I checked this information 3 times to double check this before making this podcast. And this is what happened. So Jimmy Thunder, after winning the IBO belt, he defeats Tony Tubbs. And then in March the 3rd, he had a non-title fight for the WBC Continental America's Heavyweight Championship against Trevor Berbick. He won the fight without no controversy. He dominated the fight. He takes on a 16-2 fighter in May for a 10-round non-title fight and then 2 rounds. Scores a first-round knockout a month later in June. And then he takes on a guy named Franco Wanyama, a 15-3-2 fighter. And for some reason, Franco knocks down Thunder in the 3rd round. He gets back up and finishes the 10-round fight. 2 judges had it scored 95-94, one for each other. The 3rd judge had it 96-93 for Franco. So the fight was a split decision defeat for Thunder. Franco won the fight. Here's the thing. Reports stated that the announcers announced to the crowd that the winner of the fight was James Thunder. But on BoxRec and Wikipedia BoxRec states here is that even when Thunder stepped in a short notice, it states here that Thunder stepped in on short notice for an injured Thomas Hearns. So Thomas Hearns was supposed to fight that night. Thunder was knocked down in the 3rd, initially awarded a split decision win after the fight. But the decision was overturned by the Michigan Athletic Board of Control on August the 17th, 1995. 9 days after James Thunder boxed against Ray Anis for a 2nd title fight, or as his title defense. So originally, Thunder was on a winning streak at this moment. They believe he won this fight, takes on Ray Anis a month later. 9 days later, the Board of Control reports that Franco won the fight. Instead of awarding another shot for him and Franco to fight, or even go for a title fight, because Franco just took on a champion who was still champion then, it just states that he lost this fight, but they still award him as a title win. So I guess they vacated the title away from him for good, even though on July the 16th, even though he had a title fight on the 8th. So should you say he vacated the title on August the 17th or something? The day when they said he lost his fight? Again, it say that the belt was stripped away from him. But all we have to say is, because of this vacancy, this is the moment when boxing changed for the IBO for the good. Because on January the 12th, 1996, the 1992 bronze medalist in the Olympic Games of Super Heavyweight, Brian Nielsen, steps into the ring with a 23-0 record. and wins by a round 2 TKO against a 24-4 fighter at 28 years old, Tony La Rosa. He wins the IBO belt. Now, here's the problem. See, this is something that we all have to know. Now, Brian Nielsen, 24-0, IBO champion. So this is something I really want to talk about because people are saying that Brian Nielsen was taking on nobodies and a waste of a time of opponents that were just past their prime, jobbers, waste of time, truck drivers, 7-Eleven, main event wannabes. So considering I'm talking about this right now, only I'm here to review the IBO belt. And because Brian Nielsen was having non-title fights in the middle of his IBO title reign, how about we review Brian Nielsen's entire resume from start to finish? And this might take a half an hour. We might surpass the 1 hour mark until we end this episode. So get ready. Strap in, buckles tight. So let's see how terrible Brian Nielsen's entire career is and see how bad it is. So let's do it. So in 1992, he had 2 pro fights, 6-round fights, win easily. Nothing interesting. His career would go on differently 5 pro fights later, where he comes out with 4 more fights by decision and an 8-round fight. Took on one journeyman fighter in October, which was a decent fighter. So not bad. In 1994, he comes out of nowhere with not 1, not 3, not 5, but 7 pro fights. And his fight in October was against James Bone Crusher Smith, which in that fight, to be honest, in the start of March the 25th, he did score his on February the 18th, Brian Nielsen did score a round 2 KO in his first ever knockout win in his 8th pro fight. So he started to win some fights by knockout. James Bone Crusher Smith would be a huge victim for him because by round 5, James Bone Crusher Smith sustained a cut over his left eye due to a head clash and was unable to continue. Again, James Smith at that time in October of 94 was 41 years old and Nielsen was 29. But still, it was a good win for him for what it was. And then by the end of the year, he defeats a guy named Terry Anderson. And then in January of 95, he fights against another journeyman opponent named Jeff Lapkin. Scores an 8-round fight. Not bad. He defeats a 6-1 fighter named Matt Green, first round knockout, goes a 5-round cornerman stoppage. He goes to the MGM Grand in Las Vegas on March the 11th against an 8-8 fighter named Doug Davis, his only fight in the USA. And that fight was by the promoter. The promoter's name, nope, get me back there. Oh, wait a minute. There was another fight that happened back in March the 5th of 1994 when Brian Nielsen took on against Ross Purity, the first ever boxer that defeated Vladimir Klitschko 4 or 5 years later. And Ross Purity had a 6-6 record, and that fight took place in the Auditorium. And that was by promoter Bob Arum, which was in the middle of James Toney versus Tim Whittle and Oscar De La Hoya taking on the Denmark of one of the brothers from Denmark. Interesting. Yeah. So his second trip in the USA came back in March the 11th. Brian Nielsen went back this time with another promoter named Rock Newman during the time when Riddick Bowe fought against Herbie Hyde for the heavyweight champion. So I did talk about that. I did talk about that in my last episode where Brian Nielsen was part of the show. Oh boy, I'm about to lose my... I think my recorder is about to turn off any second now. I hope that doesn't happen. So, here's my plan. He comes in 6 days later, goes back to his country after that fight in the U.S., wins a fight. By April, and then in June, he scores another fight by disqualification after a 2-round knockout. Wins another fight against a 36-2 fighter. And then he takes on against Tony Tubbs in October the 20th, which was another win for him. And by the way, Tony Tubbs was 37 years old at the time and not good because he lost against Alexander Zolkin recently. So not good. And then on November the 24th of a month later, he takes on against former cruiserweight champion from Puerto Rico, Carlos de Leon, who was 36 years old at the time. And the problem was, last August, a year ago, Carlos lost by a TKO against Corey Sanders. So that's not good for Brian Nielsen to take on those type of fighters. But again, Nielsen did it. That would be his 23rd win. Another win from another champion. So he is taking on champions, by the way, even though they are in their mid-30s. So take that for what you will. And then 2 months later, he defeats Tony La Rosa. So, okay, not bad. So the start of 1996, after that win, a month later in February, he takes on a guy named Jeff Lally, a 16-5 fighter. Wins by 2 rounds. Tastes like water. Yeah, it's all water. And then on March the 29th, he fights against a guy named Phil Jackson, who was sort of a title contender back in the day. And Phil Jackson was 31 years old at the time, and he did lose against Chris Bird in November recently. And he did have some interesting fights in his career. So this might have been the best fight for Brian Nielsen in his entire career because Phil Jackson was 31 years old at the time, 35-3. Not bad. And he did stop him after the end of round 6. And this was for the IBO belt. And even though Phil Jackson did not answer to the 7th round. So good win for Brian. This might be a good one. So a month later in April, he fights another 8-round fight against a nobody, just like Jeff Lally. The guy was 21-7. And then he fights against Mike Hunter, a 26-6-2 fighter, in a 12-round fight for his second title defense in May the 31st. He scores a 4-round knockout in the 4th round in the final seconds of the fight. And at the time, Mike Hunter was already trying to come back from his defeats against Alexander Zolkin and Marion Wilson, which were 2 fights by split decision defeats. So seeing Brian Nielsen defeat him by 4th round knockout, even though Mike Hunter was 36 years old and his last 6 pro fights all went by decision, with 3 of them being losses, that's not bad. Not bad. At least he managed to win the fight by knockout, so not bad for what it is. And then, okay, this is the part I don't understand. On September the 13th, he takes on a guy named Jerry Halstead. Now, Jerry Halstead is this guy that has this bald head, and he almost looks like this murderous grunt of a German. Jerry the Wimpy Halstead, at the time, he had a record of 85 wins, 15 defeats, and 1 draw. And maybe some no contests here or there, but still, he was on it. Now, of course, Jerry Halstead, his last pro fight after he lost against someone in May, he did win a fight against a jobber in July. The problem was, this guy had a wide record in his career. Ever since he lost against Yoshiki Nishijima, who should have been one of the boxers in the light heavyweight or so that would have fought for one of the world minor weight titles back in the day, should have been champion in his career. Because, as said before, Yoshiki Nishijima was the fighter that became WBF World Cruiserweight Champion in 97 as the first and only Japanese boxer to become a world champion in any of the organizations in the cruiserweight as a Japanese fighter. So that says a lot. And considering that Jerry Halstead was one of his tough opponents, would have been a big deal for Jerry Halstead to have this fight as a title fight. Unfortunately, he goes in the ring to fight with Brian Nielsen in an 8-round fight. It wasn't for a title. Yes, Brian Nielsen knocked him down by KO in 2 rounds. And by the end of the year, Jerry lost against guys like Jeremy Williams, a guy named Rudinger May, who was a 15-0 fighter in April. And then in December of 97, Vladimir ended his career with a 2nd-round TKO, giving this bald guy that looked like a WWE wrestler back in the 60s his last pro fight. Again, Jerry Halstead never had a lot of careers into himself, but if he would have fought for a title, this would have been something to talk about. That wasn't meant to be. So he does that. A month later in October, he goes for another title fight. That's a non-title fight. Goes 6 rounds against someone with a 24-10 record. Fights against Marcus Rhodes in November the 30th, this time from the country of Austria, and wins that fight, which is another non-title fight. And then in January of 1997, after 1 year of holding on to the title, his 3rd title defense would be his most controversial and probably his biggest win against 47-year-old Larry Holmes. And controversial, as you say, because I had Larry Holmes winning the first couple rounds of the fight. Now, even though Brian Nielsen did do a good job when I saw the fight, he came into round 3, round 4, barely in a round 5 situation, which was tough for me to judge. And then in round 6, Larry came back tough. So the fight was even then. Brian comes back in round 7, try to put on some work. And then in round 8, Larry Holmes barely wins the 8th round. And then, thinking this fight was going to be close, it wasn't. Larry Holmes dominates the last 4 rounds with nothing to be judged for. I had him winning 116-112 after this fight. And for some reason, one of the judges had it 116-115 for Holmes. Weird score. And then the others had it 116-113 and 115-113 for Brian Nielsen. Now, I don't want to review this fight, but this fight was ridiculous. Even though this might have been the biggest win for his career, I will say, though, for all due to respect, even though Larry Holmes never had another shot for a world title, even though he was losing all of his 6 pro fights by utter defeat, 4 heavyweight championships, whether it was Oliver McCall and, like I said, Tyson and many others later on, there were some decencies here. But again, it's nothing much to talk about. I watched this fight a dozen times, and watching it back, it does make you wonder for Holmes, because I just feel bad for him. I feel bad for Holmes because he just seemed like he was not in the right mood. Like, he was 47 years old, but he seemed like he went in there like he was the youngest Holmes as he was. Because even though it is crazy, because in the post-fight quotes after the fight, Holmes on the disputed decision stated, "Why do they do this to me? I'm a nice guy." Well, in Denmark, you're not, because you're an American. Nielsen is a Denmark fighter. And of course, Nielsen, on his 47th old opponent, points out, "I hadn't expected to meet an elderly man in such good condition." Well, yeah, because a fighter like that can still box someone like that, you bet. Again, this would have been a great win for Nielsen just for the heck of it. It would have been. It does stink to see it go down like that, but again, it just goes to show you that maybe Brian Nielsen is not a good fighter after all. But in all hindsight, 1997, and 1998, there would be some moments in his career where you think that Nielsen was going to do better. So here's the thing. Brian Nielsen achieves his third title defense. 2 months later, in March the 14th, he fights against Pedro Daniel Franco, the same person who actually fought against multitude of great fighters in his day. Now, of course, Daniel Franco never had a lot of skills in his career. So again, I can understand why they turned this into an 8-round fight. But again, Nielsen did took him on and won the fight. And then on May the 2nd, remember when I said that Damon Reed got knocked out 52 seconds in the first round against Herbie Hyde? Well, Damian Reed, 18-0, a guy that was taking on a bunch of jobber records and a waste of time and a few no contests in 96 and such. And his last fight in April was an 0-25-1 fighter. His 18-0 record was lousy, but he had an 18-0 record as a 25-year-old American from Topeka, Kansas, fought Brian Nielsen in an 8-round fight. Why this was not a title fight, we'll never know. All we know is Brian Nielsen dominated him in 8 rounds and won by decision. And then on June, a month later, Brian takes on James Pritchard in a non-title fight. And yes, Pritchard, his resume, losses against guys like Tim Witherspoon, Orlin Norris, Herbie Hyde, Michael Moore, Corey Sanders, and friggin' Damian Reed, which is crazy. Reed fought him later after he lost against Nielsen. Lost against guys like Darnell Wilson, Darryl Wilson, and Vladimir Klitschko. And Gary Mason, who was a 34-0 jobber at the time, and he lost his career against Lennox Lewis in 91 that ended his career after defeating James Pritchard in December of 1990. Lost against guys like Michael Dokes and Johnny Perlou and Pierre Coetzee, some good fighters in the 80s and such, and sheesh, wow. Like Brian Nielsen, yeah, that's not much for a competitor to take on against. So later in July, he defeats Marcus Gonzalez, a journeyman, defeats a guy named Bruce Douglas, no relation to James Douglas, Buster Douglas, scores a first-round KO in September. Later in December, he scores a 6-round knockout against Crawford Grimsley, who already lost his last 2 pro fights against George Foreman in Japan in November and James Thunder in March of this year in 97. By 13 seconds in the first round. You know, that famous moment when they both came into each other and James Thunder came out of nowhere and just hit him so hard, and referee Montel Oswald decided to just keep counting to 10, and the announcers are saying, he's down, there's no count for that. To this day, 13 seconds in male boxing is somewhat credited as the quickest knockout in history at 13 seconds with 1 punch. James Thunder, that's pretty crazy. And surprisingly, some years later, a decade, there's also another blooper sports moment where a guy came out wearing ridiculous trunks, like a Superman hero trunks, and it was so bad that the commissioners told him to go back to change up with his wardrobe malfunction, came back again, and then they said, no, you can't do that. So they took him back to the dressing room again, and then they made him wear a crotch or something, or a crotch protector or something, and he was so upset, and his opponent was such impatient that they just wanted the fight to go on. So the guy with the Superman hero came in and just said, screw it, just let this fight happen. So ding, 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 he charges in, but his opponent, just waiting for his opportunity, he sees him coming after him, so he just bam goes and he hits the canvas, and that fight lasts at 13 seconds as well. To this day, no one knows which is the quickest knockout, but they still believe that Crawford Grimsley and James Thunder is the quickest knockout. That is until Sinisa Estrada scored a 7-second knockout against Miranda back in 2020, which is the quickest fight in women's boxing history, if you don't want to count the F.A. Ajagba win and that 1-second DQ in 2018. But let's not get to that. So yeah, Brian Nielsen takes on those guys, which is Ridiculous. Like, this guy got beat 13 seconds in the first round against James Thunder in March, and then under 7 months later, he's fighting Nielsen, and Nielsen dominates him in 6 rounds? That's ridiculous. And Crawford Grimsley would fight another fight that year and another one the next year and retire, come back in 2001 with a draw and then the loss a year later. Jeez, man, come on. But it gets better, because a month later in November, Brian Nielsen gets his 4th title defense against a 41-0 Don Steele. And he KO'd him in 2 rounds. Who's Don Steele, you might ask? Where is that 41-0 record? How did this guy with a 41-0 record came out with a round 2 defeat? I'll show you. Don Steele, born in South Carolina, living in Alabama, and there is a video on YouTube I actually found of a news report stating that there's a guy dancing around with sweeping a mop in a strip club or a bar, dancing with a mop or something, and they later report that he's known as Don Steele, who was abducted into the Hall of Fame of some regional boxing Hall of Fames. And it states here that Don Steele, his career review states here, quote, Don Steele, a truck driver turned boxer. Truck driver. I respect that. Stocky, yet powerful build, brutal puncher, one-punch knockout artist. Was profiled? Is it profiled? Yeah, it was an L. Yeah, profiled. I gotta zoom in so I can read this properly. Talking gibberish. This part upsets me so much. So it says here, was profiled as a promising heavyweight prospect when he was 24-0 with 24 knockouts in Boxing Illustrated, scored 43 consecutive knockouts, but one fight was an unsanctioned match. After losing his first fight, Brian Nielsen, his career took a nosedive. So Don Steele, so his 3rd pro fight was a no contest. Great. Everything else is, no, it's all normal to me. Huh. Yeah, okay, so looking at Don Steele's entire pro boxing career from 1994, yeah, this guy was just taking on jobbers. This was just a bunch of, this is the worst list ever. This is horrible. What is, like, it's great that someone like a hype job contender like Don Steele got a title fight against someone, but this record of, there's no good fighters on this list that he's known for fighting. This is the worst record I've ever seen in boxing. Like, I would rather say Peter McNeely has a terrible record, or Ty Fields, David Nino Rodriguez, or the guy Ken Norton fought back in 76 who had a loud 38-0 record, and his record went down from a first round KO. I gotta look that up again. But again, it's this record, 41-0 or 42-0, this is terrible. So Don Steele comes back in April of 99, a full year and a half after losing against Nielsen, loses in the 3rd round TKO against Richie Melito, and then in December wins a fight, wins another one in July against another nobody, and gets another nobody fight 3 months later, and then he takes on Ray Mercer in March of 2001, loses by round 5 KO. He loses a 4-1 one fighter in December that same year, a guy named Giles Knox, and then rematches him a year later in September for the South Carolina Athletic Commission South. I don't give a damn what the title is. And that's his only fight he ever won by decision, only to take on a guy named Timo Hoffman in March of 2003, a year later, gets upset by a 2-round KO loss, and then takes on Donnell Holmes in January of 2005. Dude, this is the worst. What is this? And keep this in mind, Don Steele was 28 years old, so he was a young prospect fighter. What a waste of time. Like he has another undefeated record. So after he takes on a 26-8-1 fighter in December for his first round knockout, he takes on a guy named Joey Guy in February the 27th, goes 8 rounds to decision. Joey Guy had a 16-0 record. He was 25 years old, and his record's a lot better than Damon Rude, or frig me. He has a couple interesting wins, but not better than Brian Nielsen's 40-0 record, which he couldn't win a single round. Well, maybe one judge did. He would go on to lose against a few other interesting fighters like George Kandelaki, Joe Messi, Francis Botha, Clifford 18, Tuo Bjorn Thompson, Lamont Brewster, Vindy. Dude, what the frig? And Brian Nielsen was the first one to beat this guy, and this was a non-title fight, just like in December. Jeez. Dude. Okay, so this is interesting. Come September the 4th, he takes on a 13-3 fighter, scores a second round knockout, 8-round fight. He does another 8-round fight 2 weeks later on the 18th against a guy named Terry Ray, who had a 36-6 record. A long-time record at 35 years old, and Terry Ray, I do remember him because of the picture of his USA he's wearing. He only goes through 5 rounds by knockout in an 8-round fight. Brian fights another fighter a month later in October the 16th against a 16-18-2 fighter, 2-round KO. And then in November the 6th, he fights against former WBF and IBO heavyweight champion Sakura Hagiwara himself, Lionel Butler. And at this moment, Lionel Butler is 27-13-1, and he goes into this fight, and with no mercy, Brian Nielsen scores a first round KO on him to win. 2 minutes and 37 seconds. This would be his 5th and last title defense. So how did Brian Nielsen lose the belt? When did he lose the belt? Not for long, because 2 weeks later on the 27th, he takes on a longtime journeyman fighter named Dan Murphy, goes 2 rounds TKO, good win for Nielsen. So by the end of 1998, Nielsen has a 46-0 record. So what does he do? Simple. In the start of his first fight in 99, on February the 12th, he takes on Peter McNeely, Hurricane Peter McNeely. And surprisingly, at 30 years old, Peter McNeely still can't get nothing done. Not one damn bit. At this moment in 97 and 98 and so on, and 96, after his third loss against a guy named Louis Monaco, all he's doing is winning fights by decision and a couple fights by disqualification. Nielsen goes out of there and knocks him out in the 3rd round by KO, which was a non-title fight. Again. And then in March, a month later, he fights against a guy named Paul Phillips, 2nd round KO. So that's his 48-0. So yeah, you might think to yourself that Brian Nielsen might retire undefeated, or maybe he's going to fight for a World Heavyweight Championship, believing that some people might think that, hey, maybe the IBO belt might be a major belt one day, and he might be the retired undefeated fighter like Rocky Marciano. If that's what he was thinking of. Hey, it might come true, but his undefeated record, not for long. Because a month later, on April the 16th, he takes on 2-time heavyweight champion, 46-8, Tim Witherspoon. Unfortunately, Tim Witherspoon did not get nothing done in this fight. Tim Witherspoon, 48 years old. By 1996, he has nothing left to prove. Yes, he defeated George Luis Gonzalez after Gonzalez suffered his defeat with Riddick Bowe, but by December, he lost against Ray Mercer. And then never came back until 11 months later in November, takes on a random dude, and then a month later, he loses against Larry Donald by unanimous decision, like Ray Mercer. And then in April of 98, he loses against James Thunder by decision. Andrew Gloat defeats him in October by unanimous decision. And Brian Nielsen, who just turned 34 years old at this time, scores a 4-round TKO. And again, this is a 10-round fight, not an 8-round fight, which makes you wonder what would have happened in his next fight. At this moment, I watched the footage of the fight. I've been reading comments on YouTube. So many comments on YouTube are so ridiculous. And you know what's crazy about Brian Nielsen's boxing career? One referee has refereed so many of Brian Nielsen's fights, and his name is Jess Anderson. And Jess Anderson would never ref another fight again in 2000. And it might be because he would retire from reffing fights until the end of 2000. And I have a feeling it might be because of this fight right here. He reffed so many fights with Brian Nielsen. I just had to count how many he even had to ref his fights. And it's hard to find fights that he did. He even judged some of the fights in his career. Like one fight when he judged in 93 and then reffed it 2 months later with Nielsen. Like, take this for what you will. Jess Anderson has judged some of his fights, but he reffed his fights so frequently there. He even judged his first fight with Larry Holmes, which he gave his opponent the win. Jess Anderson has reffed out a multitude of probably 15 pro fights he's ever reffed with Brian Nielsen. And this fight, he would never ref with him again. Or so I thought. He would judge with him. He would actually judge one more fight with Nielsen in 2000. And of course, as looking at his resume again, that would be it. This fight would ruin Nielsen's career forever. 47-4-0, 1 no contest. Dickie Ryan fights at 32 years old in the USA, living in Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska might have a fighter they're going to be pleased about, as they just defeated a 49-0 Denmark fighter. Now at this moment, Dickie Ryan has been fighting fights against some nobodies. He lost against Vitaly Klitschko in May of last year, had a no contest months later, defeated Robert Strickland, who, again, I'm not going to get into that, but that was last March in his last fight. So Dickie Ryan, all I could say is Brian Nielsen comes into the fight. He outboxes him. He scores a knockout in the 4th round, and after 5 rounds, Nielsen is just outboxing him like a piece of cake. Seriously, he does. Like, from Brian Nielsen defeating a guy that was a 2-time heavyweight champion by the 4th round, and you have Dickie Ryan in his last pro fight in March was against Robert Strickland, who is a Sakura Hagiwara, who retired with a record of 0-19, all by knockout. Yeah, that's what Dickie Ryan's last pro fight was, by first round knockout. Comes into this fight, and even though reports stated that he had dehydration problems, which is why Nielsen was doing bad with his performance, he was still winning the fight. He was handedly winning the fight so much, but by the mid part of the fight, he got tired, and Dickie came out in the 6th round, punished him on as hard as he could, but Nielsen came back in the 7th round, and for some reason, he got tired. He got blessed. And in the next championship rounds of round 8, round 9, he was getting hurt so bad. At this moment, he was barely making it through. And then in the 10th and final round, Dickie, halfway through the last round, comes in, and Jess Anderson saves Brian Nielsen from getting hurt badly, waves the fight out in round 10. gives him his first pro defeat. And even though reports stated that he was tired, nearly quitting several times before the referee finally forced to close the show, they had reports dehydration problems with Nielsen. Part was the later given as the reason for his performance. Again, Nielsen would have won that fight. Yeah. And look at this. We're 1 hour into this episode, and this is the end. This is the end of the IBO story. So around this time, the belt was vacated away from Nielsen because of this fight. And then months later on November, Lewis gets a rematch with Holyfield, and the IBO belt was on the line. That's it. That's the story of the IBO in the 20th century, and that's it. Crazy. So what happened to Dickie Ryan and Brian Nielsen after this whole charades? And even though Dickie Ryan, people do say that Dickie Ryan did become champion as an IBO because he defeated Nielsen. Well, here's the thing. He went on to win a few more fights with guys like Marcus Rhodes, a rematch with Brian Yates, the jobber, had another fight with Adolfo Washington, another contender, which was a no contest. But by the end of 2000, didn't do well. Nielsen takes on guys like Shane Scuffle, gets a 5th round win 3 months later, takes on Dale Crow, the guy that ended the boxer of Greg Page for that famous moment when he threw a punch and then shoved him and then got his body to the back of the ring. And then Greg Page never became the same guy again, and he passed away due to that horrible injury fight. That Dale Crow, who was 16-1 at the time during that moment when Nielsen defeated him in October of 99. And Crow became a more controversial boxer outside of the ring. So Nielsen took care of him in 8 rounds. He still scored a round 1 and a round 2 KO against some guys with okay records in October and November. And then in January, he defeats Troy Weeda, a 35-3-2 fighter for the IBC Heavyweight Champion, which BoxRec still does not recognize with, by a round 8 KO. Goes in February against guys like Jeff Pegasus, Thomas Williams, and Jeremy Williams. Defends the title then in April, and then comes back 5 or so months against Kevin Cook with a 1st round win. 2nd round with Andy Sample in November. And then in December the 1st, he has a rematch with Dickie Ryan in an 8-round fight. And of course, Brian Nielsen gets his rematch win deservingly. But again, the damage was done. The damage was done, and there's nothing they could have done. Dickie Ryan, on the other hand, that performance of him losing against the 59-1 fighter he defeated before, goes 60-1, his career died as well. He did have an IBC super heavyweight vacant win in June of 2001 against Andy Sample, which is Dickie Ryan's later victory then after his professional defeat against, mostly against Nielsen. And by the way, you want to know what's crazy? I still find it interesting about Lionel Butler, because even though Lionel Butler got knocked down in the 1st round in his career against Brian Nielsen, he still continued to box for some years. He came back in 2002, won some fights, lost against Andre Peludo, defeated Fred Cassie, which was one of his last greatest fights when he came back 6 years out of retirement in 2009 after his pro 2nd round defeat, but still lost against guys in 2010 like Andrei Fedosov and Damian Willis. But again, that was nothing much of a record for them. While for Dickie Ryan, Brian Nielsen, on the other hand, Nielsen was losing against guys in 2002, guys like Stefan Nielsen, Timo Hoffman, again, defeated some jobbers and nobodies in 2003, and lost against Nikolai Valuev, the Ivan Drago of pro boxing, in 2004 by 1st round knockout. Yeah, crazy. Dickie did score a 10-round TKO final round, got a no contest. Then in 2006, he lost against Shannon Briggs. And then a year later in 2007, Hasim Rotman, who has been reported that Hasim Rotman is coming back to boxing after 12 years, as he's fighting in July the 14th in the ESL ballpark in Rochester. So yeah, that's the end of Dickie Ryan's pro boxing career then. While for that being the case, To be honest, even though we're over the past 1 hour mark here, Brian Nielsen, on the other hand, still tried his best to get a title fight. Because in 2001, after his win against Dickie Ryan, he finally gets some opportunities. He fights a guy named Benji Baker, which was just a decent win, scores it 6-round TKO in an 8-round fight. 2 months later, in June the 16th, he takes on Orwin Norris, who was in a 12-round fight, 35 years old, and wins the fight barely. And then in October, 4 months later, he takes on Iron Mike Tyson, who was also past his prime at the time, at the age of 35. Nielsen was 36 at the time, and Tyson, he outboxed him. He came out in the fight. He went to his country of Denmark, threw out every single punch he got from Nielsen. In round 3, he knocked out Nielsen, got back up, scored a few more rounds, and Nielsen, he just couldn't answer the bell to round 7, and it was a 10-round fight. That would be Mike Tyson's last great win until he lost against Lewis and then took on Clifford 18 in 2003, and that was his last win, but the rest is history. While for Nielsen, he did fought a month later against Ken Murphy, won, and then in April of 2002, he fought against Uriah Grant, a 2-time cruiserweight champion, IBF and IBO, who was a record as a jobber-type fighter from Jamaica, but lucky underdog fighter. Nielsen took care of him in 8 rounds by decision, and that's the end of his career. He came back 9 years later on May the 7th, 2011, to fight in a Legends boxing fight against Evander Holyfield. Both Holyfield and Nielsen, this would be their last pro fight in their career, and Nielsen just went in there and didn't do nothing. 3 of the judges had 88-82 after the fight, but for me, I had it all rounds winning for Holyfield. Nielsen just wasn't there to box. He was just wasting his time, and Holyfield, who was the former WBF World Heavyweight Champion last year ago, comes in, wins the fight in round 10 TKO, and that's it. That was around the same night when Kubrat Pulev defeated Derek Rossi when he was 11-0, and Cecilia Brækhus, who was 17-0 in her career, and won the fight against Chevelle Hellbach, or Halbach. So that's the end of their careers, and that's the end of the IBO. So here's my final thoughts with the IBO, and even though I have 19% left of my battery, so I better start ending this video before it gets worse. Okay, here's my final thoughts. Quinquin Thomas, Lionel Butler, Darnell Nicholson, Jimmy Thunder, and Brian Nielsen. What do I have to say about them? Well, in all hindsight, these are some interesting fighters. Lionel Butler did become a massive underdog legend. Quinquin Thomas came out of nowhere and still proved that he did some interesting stuff, and this might have been surprising. Even though his opponent he defeated wasn't good, Darnell Nicholson, forgotten, won the fight, and just left. Jimmy Thunder and Brian Nielsen, they proved themselves to it. And even though all of these 5 fights ended with, here's the thing, all of these 5 boxers that won these fights, they vacated it or relinquished the title. Only Darnell Nicholson relinquished the title, while the other 4 vacated their titles and stripped. Because Jimmy Thunder lost his belt because he lost against an opponent that was a non-title fight, even 9 days after he made his second title defense, and then reported that he lost the fight during his other last fight. So there, Brian Nielsen lost against a guy that was a non-title fight, while Darnell Nicholson just vacated the title away and never cared about it. Same with Quinquin Thomas, who vacated the title to fight in another minor weight belt. And Lionel Butler, he just vacated it without not even a care in the world. So it just goes to show you what minor weight belts were back then. It was just win the belt and then get rid of it because you're not going to pay sanction fees for it. And that's all I have to say about this. It is what it is, but at the end of the day, I really can't say much about it. And even though the first 30 minutes of this podcast were just, or 20 minutes of this podcast was just me talking about this stuff, while the rest of this half an hour show was just me talking about Brian Nielsen and his lousy resume. And you know what? My final thoughts with Nielsen is Oh, yeah, that's definitely water. I'm not drinking that. But my final thought on this was it's not as terrible, but it's not that good. But you know what? I am glad to talk about Brian Nielsen because his entire record and resume does go to show you. Don't get me wrong, Brian Nielsen did defeat some world champions, so you gotta give him credit depending on how old those fighters were. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. And again, should the IBO belt be a major belt one day, depending if one of the four organizations get vacated or out of business by IRS for some reason, if they repossess it for something, like how can the IRS repossess an organization? I don't know if that would happen. But my point is, my final thought is the IBO belt, I don't know, talking about it from Lennox Lewis winning the title and Hasim Rotman defeating him, and then he wins it back, and then Vladimir Klitschko takes the belt with the IBF with his title as well. Tyson Fury defeats him, Joshua wins the belt, and then Andy defeats him, and Joshua wins it back for him, and now Usyk still has the belt. At the end of the day, I just think with these 14 pro fights and with Joshua and Lewis being the only two to become two-time champions and Vladimir Klitschko holding the title for 18 title defenses, and Brian Nielsen did it for 5. So that's a record there. And he holds the record for the longest title reigns in the 20th century. So at the end of the day, good run. Good job. I don't think there were so many promising stars in this boxing world, but you know what? I'll give the IBF some credit. Not good, but you know what? Not bad. So anyway, we'll wish everyone best of luck in the future and see what happens. Next time, I am going to think about something else. But we'll stick to that later. So thank you very much for watching this, and see you next time.